Okay, very good. Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Let me know. Okay. A little bit higher, okay. I don't think the mic, I'm just going to shout. So much for technology, right? We're going to do it the way politicians used to speak, really loudly, right? We really were good speakers. Well, good evening. I'm Dr. Eric Schmaltz, Professor of History, Co-Executive Director of the Northwestern Institute for Citizenship Studies, and Co-Executive Director. Before we begin, a few reminders for us. You can turn off our cell phones, smartphones. I double-checked on mine. It's off. So please do that before we begin. Additionally, I know some of my colleagues and I, we've got sign-in sheets in the back table, a pen, and we have different categories. So if you need to sign in for your professor, please do that at the end of the session. I know some of you have done it already, but those who have not, please do that at the end of the talk tonight. We'll give those to the appropriate professors. Well, on behalf of the Northwestern Oklahoma Institute for Citizenship Studies and the Department of Social Sciences, I want to thank you all for attending the 2017 Presidential Lecture Series. This year's topic concerns President John Quincy Adams, who served in office from 1825 to 1829. But his political and public career spans several decades before and after his term in office. He lived from 1767 to 1848, a very long lifetime. Indeed, this year we are celebrating his 250th birthday anniversary, right? So that's a good number. He was one of America's best educated, well-traveled presidents, as we'll find out. And I like that term that Dr. Mason used. He's our first jet-setting president. So that's pretty nifty. He emerged victorious in 1824 after probably one of the most controversial contested presidential elections in American history. Makes today's stuff look pretty tame, actually. Also distinguishing John Quincy Adams is that he was the son of the second president, John Adams, thus becoming part of that most exclusive club of father-son presidents in our nation's history, plus the other being George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. This year marks our 8th presidential lecture series at Northwestern, and this is our 7th anniversary of the endowment that founded our institute formally. So this is a very good, lucky 7th year for us. On this special occasion now, though, I want to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Mr. Robert Shimp of Boston, Massachusetts. And we're very grateful for him to share his insights with us tonight. We had a good visit on the ride back from Oklahoma City yesterday, and he's a wealth of information, and we're glad to have him. Mr. Shimp is a PhD candidate in history at Boston University. In the fall of 2014, he received a Cambridge University American History Fellowship at Clare College in England. In the spring of 2011, he graduated magna cum laude with a BA degree in history and broadcast and electronic communications at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, very early now, even in his promising career, which continues to grow, he's published presentations at conferences. I think he had a radio program or a media outlet presentation. He spoke at various public events. Moreover, he's published a book review. He's also received a number of grants and fellowships in recent years. In addition to holding, or actually serving several years as a teaching fellow at Boston University, since 2011, Mr. Shimp has worked as a National Park Ranger at the Adams National Historical Park in Boston, Massachusetts. And he's part of the Pathways program there. And so in this capacity, he gives guided tours as well as works on on-site research development programs and content. So really, in a way, he's kind of both in academia as a researcher and scholar, and he's also doing some work in the public history sector. His academic interests include, of course, United States political history, the American Revolution, 18th and 19th century United States foreign relations, and of course, John Quincy Adams. And I want to say the Adams political family, so nobody confuses it with the Adams family. Right, so I can say Adams political dynasty might be better. And with that, I want you to turn matters over to my colleague, Dr. Aaron Mason, the co-executive director of the Institute, along with me, and also our keynote speaker, Mr. Shimp. We're going to have them discuss some issues in the first part of the program, but we're going to open up some time near the end here, and ample time for audience questions and comments. So with that, we'll get started. And Dr. Mason, do you need any help with the camera? We all set?
I think we'll be all right, yeah. Appreciate that. If you want to come check it when I walk down there, it'd be fine, but
We'll make a transition.
Okay.
Peaceful transition of power.
Well, I didn't agree to that.
As long as I get to go to retirement. Let's check out this one.
I want to take the easy way out and use this one. Do the best we can here. Maybe I should just shout as well. So, can everyone hear? Everyone hear pretty well there? Okay.
Good.
I have no objection to holding it if that's what we need to do. But first of all, I wanted to thank Robert for coming. And was on sort of short notice. It was difficult to get him because just returned from his honeymoon when I called him. So there's nothing like going on your honeymoon, having some guy from Oklahoma calling, hey, this is more important. I need your attention. I'd like you to come out and talk. So he was very gracious and was happy to return my call. So I appreciate that. I hope I didn't cause any problem. I didn't quite understand what was going on. But one of your colleagues had told me, well, you want to give him a call, but didn't quite explain what was going on. But anyway, we're really glad you're here. We're glad you're here. Appreciate you coming. And I was wondering how long it was going to take us to get to the Adams family joke here, So, but Dr. Schmaltz already stole my thunder, so that's okay. So we've already gotten that one out of the way, right? So everybody can do the collective clicking there. So, but just some, where do you begin with John Quincy Adams? And in fact, I was really proud of calling him the jet-setting president. But after having spoken with Robert after a while, I realized that the title I had created was not nearly as good as the one that he has created. And I'd like him to tell us what you like to refer to JQA as in regards to the interesting life that he lived.
For John Quincy?
Correct.
Well, I'd like to say that in a lot of ways, he's kind of the Forrest Gump of American, at least early American founding fathers. And let me first again say thank you for having me, both Eric and Aaron, and to everyone, thank you for coming. This is a great opportunity. It's an honor to be here, and really looking forward to getting into it over the next hour and a half, 2 hours, however long we're here for. But really, he's one of those figures that does pop up at so many different places from really the inception of the nation. Certainly his, and father and mother, due to their prominence during the Revolution, he was given certainly any number of opportunities from his youth. But he physically witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill, in many ways kicking off the Revolution, the first major pitched battle of the war, 1775, climbed a few hundred yards from his house up to a hill, Penn's Hill, as it's called. You can still go up there today. And at that time, looked across a much less developed Boston harbor to see the smoke, the cannon fire, the Revolution starting. His career spanned about everything then in between, all the way up to 1848, where he was physically serving with Abraham Lincoln. At the eve of the Civil War, where they were debating the Mexican-American War and its facets in 1848. So from the Revolution through the Mexican-American War, 1775 through 1848, there are very few events I think you could find, both in domestic and foreign politics, that he wasn't a part of in some way, shape, or form. So that's, for scholars and researchers, that's both a curse and a blessing. However many years I work on John Quincy, there's no way you'll be able to fit in everything that this man did in his entire life or have an entire grasp on it. But on the flip side, he offers not just people that look at John Quincy or the family, but I think early American scholars generally so many great opportunities from the resources that both he and his family left that have been remarkably well preserved in different fashions, I think, over the subsequent decades from his life.
Yeah, you were saying that he even met Napoleon.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he saw him, didn't meet him physically, but saw him. He was there during Napoleon's 100 days in France. Actually, funny story on that day, he was trying to see him at the theater at first, accidentally bought a booth on the same side of the theater that Napoleon had purchased his, so couldn't see him there, but did see him a few days after. So saw him, and again, most of the major figures, I think, that you could toss out, and major names, he had at least a direct or at least an indirect connection to them somehow.
Yeah, let's talk, and again, it's hard to decide where to begin with him, but the most important influences on his life would have to have been his mother and his father, and Abigail Adams and John Adams. Just talk a little bit about how they impacted his life and why they were so significant.
Yeah, absolutely. By by the time that he was born in 1767. His father had worked his way up. I mean, the two homes are still standing in Quincy, Massachusetts. And for John Adams' youth, very much grew up on a farm. He was the oldest of three sons, so he was the one that was allowed, as it were, to receive a college education. But by that point, John Adams had built himself up to be, if not one of the more prominent lawyers in Massachusetts at that point. Abigail came from, you could say, a relatively well-off family, was educated within the home, but done so to an extent that other women, certainly at the time, didn't have the opportunity to. Her father was a pastor in Weymouth at the time. So she certainly had a great opportunity of literacy and education in her youth, and both of them really instilled the values of self-betterment, betterment through education, literacy, through reading to John Quincy, and absolutely, as he got older and as the revolution really commenced, duties to certainly self, family, God, but being a child of the revolution, certainly to the nation as well, to your state, to your region, but to the nation. His early life was so interwoven, with the founding of the country. It would have been impossible for him to disentangle that. But they really, again, instilled those values into him in his youth, and in different ways you see him, I think, revering both of his parents throughout his adult life, looking back on them in different ways, but clearly those resonances, I think, carried through all the way through his diary. I mean, you can read it all the way through his 80th year of life, and you see those coming through in any number of ways throughout. Beyond his parents, as did many of the founders, certainly looked to the ancient Romans, the Greeks. I think Cicero would be probably the major influence on John Quincy in terms of self-service to the republic, to your nation, but also in terms of oratory. I always like to make a joke. At Peacefield, so the family seat, there's a separate library that was built to house John Quincy's books. Now it's about 12,000 books in total. And on the mantle, there are a few small statuettes. So I especially like to say to some of the small children, growing up at least, my idols were the sports figures that I had, posters hanging on the wall. For him, it was the Greek and Roman philosophers, and there's 7 small statuettes there. So those were his idols: Demosthenes, Cicero, Socrates. You see them all physically there on the mantelpiece, and those are the individuals that at least this young man was being introduced to, and I think really helped him, especially Cicero, throughout his entire life.
Yeah, so this common thing we see in the founders of kind of like their civic values were informed by classical Roman, Greco motifs. Their ethical and their moral values are biblical Christian, Judeo-Christian ideals. Yeah, and so that's his worldview. That's cemented early on by his education, by his parents. Yeah. Today he occupies an interesting distinction with our current president in regards to the First Lady. Talk a little bit about the First Lady and the connection that President Trump has.
He does. That title we have to modify now, at least what I say and what what individuals say on the tours. Used to say Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams was the only foreign-born or First Lady not born on American soil. Obviously, that's going to have to be modified now. Just say the first one. But she had quite an interesting life trajectory herself. In many ways, I think, and maybe we'll probably get into this a little bit, JQA had somewhat of a strange upbringing. He really learned about his nation in many ways abroad. He spent so much of his youth in France, in the Netherlands. I think, for my own work, I think Britain in his time in London had maybe the greatest influence on him. So in many ways, he's learning about the country from a distance. In a similar way, Louisa Catherine was born in London to a British mother, but her father was actually American. He was from Maryland. So she was, in a similar way, at least, instilled with ideas of America, talk of American virtue, of the Revolution, of the promise of America. But she didn't step foot in the United States until, well into her 20s, and in 1801. So she certainly had, her conceptions of the nation were formed abroad. She was born in Britain, but actually schooled for France at a time, spoke French fluently growing up, was schooled in a convent, actually, for a time in France, and then went back to London for kind of her later adolescent years after the Revolution. So they both had strange, I guess, upbringings relative to the prominent places they would occupy in American politics, I think, after that. But in many ways, Louisa Catherine, you see her kind of battling with that identity, I think, throughout her life, but certainly tried to, in at least her writings, which have been 2 volumes published recently on Louisa Catherine, she's starting to enjoy her moment in the sun right now. There have been a couple of monographs that have come out on her recently that are pretty well written if anyone's interested to learn a bit more about Louisa Catherine. But she, I think, really came to, in some ways, understand American politics maybe even a little bit better than John Quincy. I mean, for at least the election of 1824, she's the one holding the balls, the galas, doing some of the behind-the-scenes politicking, really starting to move, at least to some extent, public support towards John Quincy Adams. So she really embraced, I think, what ultimately became her role in American politics, though she was so removed from the nation through the first, 27 years of their life.
And a little bit on the nature of their marriage. They were married for how long? Would you characterize? And they had quite a few children. Unfortunately, had some deaths with children. Was it a happy marriage, you think?
Right.
And let me ask this: can you compare it to, say, the marriage that his mother and father had, which was so successful?
Yeah, I would say you cannot compare it directly. In fact, in many ways, it was a fairly tumultuous marriage at times. They were both very strong-minded individuals. Certainly, I think they came to a real fondness for each other over time, but at the start, the beginning of their relationship didn't lend itself, I think, to a kind of a smooth start, as it were. They were married in London. They had met while John Quincy, so during the 1790s, he was doing some, I guess you could say, shuttle diplomacy from London via the Jade Treaty negotiations from the Netherlands back and forth. Ultimately, he would end up in Berlin. Met her. They had a courtship somewhat distant, but they were married in London in 1797 after some back and forth as to where and when the marriage would be. But very soon after their marriage, Louisa Catherine's father, Joshua Johnson, left with most of the family to go back to the United States. He was heavily in debt. His business had fallen into ruin, essentially. So instead of having a professor call him on his honeymoon or very soon after his marriage, John Quincy had all of Joshua Johnson's, basically people coming to look for money, banging down his door, asking where it was and what he was going to do about the problem. So not the greatest start, I think. And Louisa Catherine always felt that was, I think, a divide between them, because there was talk, there was an understanding of a dowry. Obviously, that didn't come to fruition. John Quincy, I think, for his partner, I think he's honest in this. I think he had moved past it, and it wasn't an issue for him. But Louisa Catherine, you see this in her writings later in life, she still saw that as a divide between them that I think never fully healed for her. Ultimately, they had 4 children that at least reached infancy. 3 sons, 1 daughter. Their daughter, by some accounts, think she was probably the first American born in Russia. However, she died at about a year and a half and was buried in St. Petersburg. The 2 oldest sons, George Washington Adams, John Adams II, we might talk about them as we go through, both died around 30 years old, relatively tragic lives for the 2 of them. Really heart-wrenching, certainly for the parents, and you see that come through in their writings and letters. And then the youngest son, at least Charles Francis Adams, he was the one that kind of happened for the few generations of the family over the 18th and 19th century. He was really the one that kind of grasped the mantle of the family, would go on to a very successful public service career, and would really devote his life to maintaining the property and the family's correspondences and letters, and it started that process of editing them. So certainly many difficulties throughout, but they, like their parents before them, did reach their 50th wedding anniversary. So the robust marriage over time that certainly had its ups and downs, I think, from the start and throughout, no question.
It's kind of ironic when you think about, not that their marriage wasn't successful, but you get kind of a different feeling when you look at John and Abigail, where they certainly have their problems. I'm sure she communicated things to him about her displeasure over things, but they were just so clearly in love. They're kind of America's first power couple and
Right.
all these things. So he certainly had a good example on what a successful marriage would be. And so he had no argument. He had no way to say he didn't have a good example.
Right, exactly. And we see that coming through at times in their letters, but I think part of the problem as well, frankly, was John Quincy's persona, which didn't really lend itself. And John Adams, you always knew where he stood. He was a very vocal, bombastic character. There's no question about about where his passions were. He let you know them quite clearly. John Quincy did not wear his emotions, on his sleeve, as it were, more reserved, subdued, some would say, cold individual at times. I wouldn't go so far myself. I think there's a little bit more nuance to that character, but that's at least how he would describe himself too, a bit of self-deprecation in the journal. So I think that in itself lent kind of a complicating factor to any sort of relationship that he would ultimately have.
Would you agree with the comment that he was probably the most qualified person to serve as president by virtue of his foreign policy experience?
Yeah, I mean, he would absolutely
Even
be
to today.
right up at the top. I mean, I think he'd be hard-pressed to find someone to surpass him. Again, by the time he became president, he'd already served 4 ambassadorial posts to the Netherlands, Prussia, Russia, Great Britain. He was a chief negotiator at the Ghent Peace Conference that had ended the War of 1812, just celebrated that bicentennial a few years ago. He served in the United States Senate. He was a supporter of the Louisiana Purchase. He had served for about 5 years as a professor of rhetoric at Harvard by that stage. Even in his youth, at the age of 14, he was officially serving the nation as secretary and translator to the U.S. mission to St. Petersburg, Russia, during the Revolution, and was present at the Paris Peace Conference to assist his father as his father's secretary. So all of that was even before his presidency, and that's not to speak anything to his 8 years as Secretary of State, just before the presidency. Any number of successes there, and I'm sure we can talk about a few of those. Certainly had kind of a laundry list of hits during his time as Secretary of State, and at that time was very much the stepping stone towards the presidency. So all of that was in the build-up to the presidency. Now, of course, with John Quincy, that didn't necessarily equate to a successful presidency, but in terms of qualifications, I think both in education, in both domestic politics, and then in foreign policy as well, I think he'd be hard-pressed to find someone with such a resume going into the office, at least.
Okay, so let's move forward then to the election of 1824, and let's talk about that election. We like to think that, those were the good old days, and people didn't resort to anything negative, and the Republicans crumbled so much since then, and our politics is just bad, and theirs was pure. So talk a little about the election of 1824, and maybe help us feel a little bit better about ourselves today.
Right.
At least there's hope, right?
Right, and thinking about that as well in terms of comparisons between maybe the vindictiveness and bitterness of elections. I think you have to take both of John Quincy's as well. So 1824, we can break that down. That was his first time. 1828, then he did run for re-election. I would say that one was the nastier of them, because all the gloves were off at that point in 1828. So you just see all sorts of newspaper attacks, personal attacks on the wives are brought into the process, the careers, there's charges of prostitution, there's charges of backstabbing all through in 1828 newspapers and public speeches. So it was right down in the mud, I think, with with anything, any claims people would make about politics today. 1828 and 1824 to an extent, even 1800 for John and Jefferson and that re-election. They're right down there, I think, with anything people might point to. But 1824 is a really interesting election, and in terms of comparisons to today as well. I mean, John Quincy, in terms of the popular vote, lost handily. He also was far behind in the electoral vote. Andrew Jackson ended up with 99 electoral votes. Essentially, it was a 4-horse race. Jackson ended up first with 99 electoral votes. John Quincy Adams was second with 84, and he only had about 30% of the popular vote, John Quincy. Third was William Crawford, fourth Henry Clay. At that time, nobody was remotely close to an electoral majority, so at that time, the top three were tossed into the House of Representatives, where the state delegations would vote on the presidency. From that stage, basically, late 1824, November, December, all sorts of behind-the-scenes deals were made or not made. There was political jockeying. And when the House of Representatives reconvened, then John Quincy, being far behind in both the popular vote and 15 votes behind in the electoral vote, ended up winning on the first ballot in the House of Representatives. He won 13 to 9 to 4, so he ended up with over 50% the majority, and he became the nation's 6th president. From the word go, there was, of course, political division, and it was a very, and I should say 13 to 7 to 4, I think, on the breakdown there for the states. I think John Quincy's biggest mistake, maybe his best decision politically, but his mistake was meeting with Henry Clay, naming him straight away to be Secretary of State, getting the Western support, at least, from the state delegations to push him towards the presidency. By all accounts, at least in the documented sources that we have, there was nothing, there were no behind-the-scenes machinations. There was no quid pro quo between the two of them. But of course, in political optics, it did not look great, and he was almost stonewalled by Congress as a result. And frankly, the Jackson campaign started only a few months after that and pushed all the way through the 4 years of John Quincy's presidency and really put him behind the 8 ball, I think, from the start of his administration.
In regards to that, then, one of the greatest accomplishments he has in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy, what do you think those would be? Right, and it's trickier to, I think, certainly point to them during his presidency. I mean, the presidency, he has some there. In terms of foreign policy, I think, for me, the biggest was while he was Secretary of State. I think the Convention of 1818, which was between the United States and Britain, set the western boundary at the 49th parallel, but also set up a joint administration for the Oregon Territory, so looking to the far Pacific Northwest, for 10 years for it to be revisited at that point. So it was kind of kicked back for a few subsequent 10-year periods, and ultimately John Quincy's idea was the United States, in terms of settlement, would overpopulate the area, that people would decide essentially just by physical presence. And I think through that kind of slow play, ultimately set up that section of the Pacific Northwest very well for the United States. I think it was a very shrewd move in that sense. In terms of his presidency, he came through really pushing forward an agenda for internal improvements, I think, broadly construed, both physical structures, but then in a more abstract sense, improvement, intellectual and the liberal arts in the general production of the nation. He pushed that through in his first annual address to Congress, and we can maybe break that down a bit because it's a really fascinating speech in terms of some of the key public addresses, both written and spoken, that he gave. Ultimately, again, he was faced essentially a stonewall from that, but he did end up getting some things through, and I think that would be, at least the legacy of that, would be his greatest domestic policy achievement. Chesapeake and Ohio Canal started during his presidency. That was a major moment for him. Certainly there were harbor improvements. There were some roads. The Cumberland Road was extended. Canals in general were somewhat better funded. There was, I think, his administration spent more on internal improvements relative to all 5 previous administrations combined. Now, that said, I think ultimately it would still have to be chalked up as a failure because it wasn't anywhere close to what he had hoped for, but did see some success in that sense. And in terms of a general American system, as it was called at the time, which would incorporate internal improvements, he did sign into legislation, perhaps problematically soon thereafter, the Tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations, as it was called thereafter, that looked to certainly protect the United States. He signed that in. It was far harsher, in fact, than what he had hoped for.
but when given the option by Congress of having a harsh tariff, protective tariff, or none at all, he did sign that into legislation. Obviously, that would become problematic a few years later with the nullification crisis in South Carolina and really set off warning bells for the impending, I think, Civil War. But in terms of legislative successes, that is an accomplishment, whether or not it was the right move at the time. I think those small successes that he had in terms of domestic policy, one would have to look to those during the 4 years of his presidency, at least.
Do you think of the presidents between he and Abraham Lincoln, there's a big stretch there, 10 presidents,
Right.
Yeah. But is he sort of a prototype of Lincoln in the sense of his promotion of internal improvements, the system of Clay and Hamilton and all this? Does he come closest to articulating Lincoln's vision, or do you? I just off the cuff there, because we can make other parallels between he and Lincoln. But do you think that he helps lay the groundwork for something Lincoln wants to do?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we see a broader kind of push. I mean, certainly now, we would take the interstate system, for instance, as a given. So you see him articulating a vision for the future that maybe was too far ahead of his time. Maybe he pushed it too far in the moment. But I think you see remnants of that coming through Lincoln. I think you still see some coming through the 20th century, maybe even to the 21st century. So I see his trajectory going even maybe beyond that 30, 40-year stretch. Though certainly being, you could say, an apostle of union, I think that absolutely would be a parallel for Lincoln. And John Quincy, to his mind, would have been preserving the union, or thought he was preserving the union, by pushing through these internal improvements that would bound the varying sections of the country together, that would allow better information to be traveled, better travel in general, to have individuals to understand their country better. And ultimately, I think through his mind, ultimately that would be the answer to ending slavery. Clearly he was mistaken in that, but I think though he didn't articulate that specifically as president, I think that's where his vision was going during his presidency. And again, maybe the political expediency wasn't there for him at the time, but that's at least where he was, I think, coming from in his presidential proposals.
And of course, always want to make this point with JQA, again, probably one of his greatest accomplishments was, as you said, when he was Secretary of State and he articulated the Monroe Doctrine. Could you talk a little bit about that, what it was, and how people get that confused, that since the name is Monroe,
Right.
James Monroe, nobody really knows much about, but those give him credit for that. It's really unfair. And talk about what a great coup that was and how well it worked out.
Yeah, right. So, I pointed to the Convention of 1818 as his greatest success, but again, there's a laundry list of foreign policy achievements during his time as Secretary of State. And perhaps the most prominent articulation of his vision for foreign policy came through the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. He wrote maybe the majority of it. Monroe certainly absolutely had a hand in it. John Quincy wrote especially the non-colonization clause in it. So there are several major tenets to it. Non-colonization of the Western Hemisphere, non-interference by European powers in the Western Hemisphere, and then more generally for John Quincy, an articulation from a previous speech that he had made that the United States, and using an address that he made in 1821, essentially saying, paraphrasing, but the United States would not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. So the United States policy needed to be here, would wish nations well abroad that share the same values of the country, but the United States itself should not and would not meddle into foreign affairs unnecessarily. So that's at least what he brought forth in 1823. And I think that was an iteration of a policy that in many ways kind of came from Washington's articulation of foreign policy, which John Quincy himself, in somewhat of a circular manner, was influencing while he was a minister abroad. So John Quincy was really witnessing the French Revolution over the 1790s, articulating that back to Washington. And then the Monroe Doctrine, I think, became a codified example of that. Now, it was a unilateral declaration. It really had no weight behind it at all. But it did, I think the policy held in saying to European nations, to the Holy Alliance at the time, and especially to Great Britain, that the Western Hemisphere is closed. This is the domain of the United States, I guess you could read in between the lines, to the emerging Latin American republics at the time. But that any future ideas of meddling in our affairs that, at least from our perspective, that time is past. So it's really an assertion of, I think, American power at that moment, which was a very bold and ambitious, I think, statement to make for such a young nation at the time. And again, I think it encapsulated this build-up going from the founding through Washington and some of John Quincy's earlier politics. And really, for the most part, that document has directed different facets of American foreign policy, certainly up through the early 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt amended it with the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904. But it was certainly, I think, in terms of actually, again, a codified, at least unilateral codification, probably the most important thing that he put forth, or at least had a hand in during his time as Secretary of State.
Talk about some things outside of his presidential, things we associate with his presidential term. He was president of the American Bible Society.
Vice President.
Oh, he was vice president. Okay, and he took a leadership role in that. Could you explain maybe why he was a prominent member of that, and did he ever make public statements as to why he was?
Yeah, he was at least a vice presidential figure in that for about 30 years, and I think that was a general manifestation at different kind of fusing together both his religious predilections with, again, using the Bible as a document to be studied and to be read, kind of tapping into that lineage as well. That literacy and biblical literacy was incredibly important for him. We see that coming from his youth. We see that in how he was raising his children as well. With his young sons, he would have, especially George Washington Adams, translate the Bible between Latin, French, English. That was their nightly fun, I guess, while they were in London. So a very, kind of stern upbringing in that sense. But he would return to the Bible throughout his entire life. He would sometimes read, 3 chapters every morning at 4 a.m. for weeks on end throughout even his adult life. As he grew older, it would kind of come and go. I think it stretches, but you see that fervency with knowing, with reading, with revisiting the Bible in particular, and I think you see that represented at least in his prominence in that organization for about 30 years. And at least for John Quincy, I think you see the real religious roots come to fruition, especially after his father's passing in 1826. That was the first time that he officially joined a church, joined the local Unitarian church, still standing right in the center of Quincy, Massachusetts. The church is there. It's the tombs of both presidents and first ladies. You can still visit them there today. So you start to see that really, I think, coalesce towards his later adult life.
It makes me think about the law that it was the Massachusetts Council passed in 1647 called the Old Deluder Act. Remember that one?
I'm familiar.
And it basically said that Satan was the deluder of society, and that it was necessary to teach the Bible to all the children in the Commonwealth. And I just make that point. It's interesting that here he is in the early 1800s. He's carrying on that tradition, and the schools used it as the primer for the children. It was a law passed in 1647 by the Massachusetts Council.
Yeah, and that general, I think, the thrust and the point behind that, I think that absolutely stood true through his life. He was certainly raised in that as a youth, or within that mindset from his parents, his father, mother, and the family's own roots, and again passing that on to his sons throughout. Absolutely, that lineage, I think, continued through.
Could you speak then to his religious beliefs as well as you can, or is it just too vague?
Yeah, like a lot of founders, he's somewhat tricky, somewhat quicksilver on this to exactly pin down. You see him going back and forth between Unitarian, Trinitarian theology through his life. And I think the closest that we really get in terms of that public sense, the vice presidency there, as he talked about, but the joining of the church in 1826, the Unitarian Church, I think that was a key moment in his life, and you see him really having these religious reflections. You see allusions to, the divine revealer, divine presence, or the great maker of our being. You see those sorts of references all throughout, his writings, his journal, his diary. And I think it wasn't until the later life that he was really ready to pin himself down to the specific congregation there. So you see the struggle, I think, throughout his life. I think it's evident. I think it's very part and parcel of the time, maybe through all times, just in different manifestations. And you see him really hashing that out in his diary, which is incredibly accessible to us today online. So you see him go through different stages. His 20s maybe, somewhat dissipates in his 20s, but really comes back to the fore, I think, in his adult life, later adult life.
Of course, he serves as one term. He's the second one-termer along with his father, so they share that ignominious distinction, right? Which is kind of ironic. He's also with his father. He refuses to meet with his successor,
Right.
And leaves town and says, "I'm done," and goes home. Something that I believe Harry Truman also did, I believe.
Yeah, and of course it's a very maybe it's only happened one other time in American history, but even today, even in the most any election in recent history, even in very bitter elections, that's a standard, that's a given. You meet with the successors, and both of them did not do that. John Adams got on the stagecoach at 4 a.m. getting out of town, so they weren't sticking around for the predecessors.
So he's defeated in 1828.
Right.
He goes home, and then he just to save time here. He's later then the only president to go back and serve in the House.
Right.
Talk a little bit about his service in the House of Representatives.
Yeah, right. So a lot of historians would position John Quincy's career as, I think maybe he said it and then others have repeated it in different forms, but 2 successful careers, interspersed by a presidency. So the presidency is maybe the anomaly in his career. So you have some domestic successes early. Certainly the foreign policy, I think, is the strong front end through his time in various positions in his ambassadorial post and certainly as Secretary of State, presidency. And then, again, to your point, he's the only president to go back and serve in the House. So not only was he going back to Congress, he wasn't going to the Senate either. I mean, he was going to the House of Representatives. And he was there for 17 years, 1831 to 1848. And that's a stretch where, for John Quincy, there's a lot of debate on this. There's at least one new work coming out on John Quincy and slavery this year, so we're starting to see more scholarship on it. This is the time, at least for him, where the gloves come off, so to speak. Never an abolitionist, but he became an ardent anti-slavery advocate within this period, and it's something that he really didn't touch as president. As Secretary of State, even as ambassador, come across certainly, you see documents of him making requests for the United States for repayments of slaves taken during the War of 1812, so he's still demanding reparations in those senses. But in the House, over that 17-year period, he seemed to become more irascible, as it were, and that's really his, one of his major pushes. Another is certainly freedom to petition in the House. He defends or battles the gag rule in 1836, which in many ways silenced even debates on slavery being brought forth in Congress. Now, for him, that wasn't so much about slavery, it was the right to petition, so he battled that. The two kind of, I think, were a bit interwoven. Certainly couldn't be disentangled at that point, but that was one of his great battles. Famously argued successfully the Amistad case of 1841. A group of enslaved Africans, members of the Mende tribe from what is now Sierra Leone, had been eventually captured and transported on the Amistad. Mutinied, a few of their captors alive. They thought they were sailing back to Africa. They were tricked, sailed eventually by night towards the United States, landed off the shores of Connecticut. Case worked its way up through the court system. And at 73 years old, John Quincy, first case he had argued in decades, picked up that case. Of course, it's been famously remade with the Amistad movie, Anthony Hopkins, about 20 years ago now, I think. Yeah. But defended that, really putting himself on the line in that moment at this later stage in his career. And then at the very tail end, was adamant in his opposition to the Mexican-American War. He, maybe more so than anyone else at the time, had done so much to extend the boundaries of the United States of America, but in that particular moment saw it as a manufactured imperialist land grab from what he perceived to be the slave power in Congress, and physically died in the Capitol 2 days after getting up to give a speech against, there was a debate on pensions for soldiers during the Mexican-American War. So he was getting up to give a speech in the House, suffered a stroke, and physically died in the Capitol 2 days later. So again, almost his entire life in public service to the nation, but having this really remarkable, and I think for many people now, or at least modern sensibilities looking back on his career, many people view that as maybe the pinnacle of what was a long and incredibly successful career, that 17-year stretch in the House.
I'm glad you mentioned the honest thought. I want to talk about that because to me that's, if he had done nothing else, just as an ex-president, to me that would have been the most phenomenal thing. He's the only, as far as I know, the only ex-president to ever argue a case. Maybe the only president.
I mean, in terms of ex-presidents, he's probably got to be about the most active, just in general. I mean, he was not...
He was a force for good.
Right, and he was not sitting idly by at that point. But to really, again, to your point, to take that case on, to put yourself out there in such a public sense, to make such a public stance, and not only to do that, but to make a coherent argument, brushing off the rust after several decades away from doing so, it really was quite the moment. And actually, just as another connection to Peacefield and to the Adams National Historical Park, the Bible that was given to him by members of the Mindy individuals is physically still in the library. It's taken its hits over the centuries, but there's a full note inside written thanking him for his service and helping to win them their freedom and their lives. So it's physically still there in the library. Typically out only one day a year on his birthday on July 11th, but otherwise it's usually out on the front table. So we're very fortunate to still have that remarkable treasure to have that tangible connection to the case.
Just to summarize, of all the things you learned about him, what's the most interesting thing that you want to leave people with here tonight that they probably don't know about him, either as a president or as a man?
Yeah, I think going back to the first point, one of the first things that I would encourage people to remember is that he's largely in many ways a forgotten president, but the career spans so much more than that. And I think his presidency itself is indispensable in understanding early American politics. I think you can't overlook it. I think it's an important moment for the nation, maybe in a sense for going in a different route than what he put forth. But I think the entire body of his work is really important. Using him, I think, even for educators, for students, as a conduit for getting at some of any important event in that period, from the Revolution through the Mexican-American War. I think he's really useful for doing that. And it's quite easy to do so now that his entire diary, over 14,000 pages, is online, in bulk. It's date searchable. So it's easy to see his thoughts quite clearly on anything really that you want. And I think importantly for his presidency, I think the important takeaway for it is that he articulated a vision for the nation in which the government would be a force for good, expanding the nation through these internal improvements. But I think, again, more importantly, and for him, it was a moral duty, it was a moral sense to improve the nation in terms, again, of the liberal arts and advancing a national observatory and a national university. Again, roads, canals, but really helping the United States progress to its fullest potential. For him, liberty, the United States being the paragon for liberty, equal power, equal potential, and it was through those articulations, I think, especially in his first address to Congress, that's where he saw the United States potentially outpacing its European rivals. And maybe ultimately we could say that definitely came to fruition, but for him, there was that moment in the 1820s in which it could have happened, and maybe that was rejected in the 1820s, but I think even in its rejection, I think his presidency was significant for that period of time. And then, of course, he came back full force in the House of Representatives after. So, if nothing else, at least look to that time in the House of Representatives, I think, after the presidency.
That's why, to me, I see a connection with Lincoln, with the railroad expansion, with the land grant act.
Right.
I just this in this idea of nationalism, he seems like the most robust president prior to Lincoln in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those articulations are very similar, and I think we see that almost coming to fruition because they're both members of that Whig Party
Yeah.
from 46 or late 47 into 48 when they're in Congress together. I mean, to your point, it's absolutely true that their visions are literally aligning. They're starting to align in some ways in that Congress. So you see that kind of thread going through from the Revolution for John Quincy, touching both ends to the Civil War.
And then Lincoln serves on the committee in the House for his funeral, correct?
Right, yeah, exactly. So Lincoln's actually, coming again full circle here, part of John Quincy's funeral, honorariums
Of course,
afterwards.
Lincoln had given the spot resolution speeches decrying demanding that Polk show the exact spot on which Mexicans had killed American soldiers, and of course he couldn't do that.
Right, yeah, and they're absolutely of that same moment in time, John Quincy Adams and Lincoln, which is really, incredible. Somebody that knew and worked with Washington, also knew and worked with Lincoln at the other end.
Okay, great. Well, we want to leave a lot of time for questions. We've gone about 45 minutes, so we have plenty of time. In order to ensure that the recording can record the questions, I want to repeat the question. So if anybody has one, please stand up, or please raise your hand and we'll recognize you. I know Moody must have a question, but I'll let him say. Okay. Yes, Professor Kels.
How did he was extremely fluent in French, going off to really speak for the Americans in Russia. Were his parents responsible? Apparently, no doubt he must have had Latin. Did he? And so the second question, did he have Greek as well?
He did. In fact, he was, again, one of those individuals, unfortunately, I'm not one of them, but one of those individuals blessed with linguistic skills, that are, beyond what the normal individual has. So the numbers vary, but you see tossed out, he was maybe fluent in 6 to 7 languages, and maybe could read up to times, and again, read is maybe loosely defined, but maybe up to 12. So the French certainly started early in the home. He was reading French under, Abigail's guidance as a child. Certainly not, any strong fluency by that point. But then at the age of 10, again, building on the opportunities that his father, presented for him, he traveled to France at the age of 10. So getting on the ship over, being physically there, being immersed in the language, he really picked that up from his youth. And then, as you point out, when he went back the second trip, so he and his father were only there for a short period on the first trip, 1779 into 1780. The second trip, when he went over, he was so fluent, because the diplomatic language of the time was French, that he was literally serving his country in St. Petersburg, Russia, because of his understanding of the language. So he had French, obviously was well-versed in Latin, and in fact, in the early 19th century, he was, I guess you could say, almost at the forefront of American Germanic studies as well. I mean, incredibly fluent in German, both written and spoken language, spent time in Berlin for about 4 years as ambassador there, so really had a strong grasp of the German language. And he dabbles at the diplomatic courts, and I think that's certainly one of the ways in which he's so successful as an ambassador, and I think somewhat mitigated the self-deprecating thoughts that he had of himself being cold, aloof, not being able to interact well with people. If you can speak their language in a place when not many others can, I think that really helped him to break down the barriers and give him great success in his diplomatic career.
Maybe an odd question, but I'm curious, after 17 years in the House, do you think you'd have anything to say to us about congressional term limits today?
Term limits.
Term limits, yeah. That's a good point. In fact, I don't think that he would, because his point in going back to begin with was, I am a public servant, and if his family told him, do not do this, what the heck are you doing? Don't go back in the House. You've done enough for your country. Just go into retirement. By all accounts, that's what he thought he was going to do, but his flip argument was, I will stand back, I will be the disinterested politician, and if a majority of my of the constituents give me the honor of going, it is my absolute duty to do so for as long as they see fit to put me into office. So I think maybe he would actually say, we'll let it roll and let the people decide on that. But if you placed him in modern society, perhaps he'd be, have a different take on it. But I think for the most part, he would let the people decide on this.
Now, to that point, he was approached by people, the 8th district of Massachusetts, sort of was where he was at, and they did beg him, they did ask him to run.
Right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, just to go on this point, I think you did a good job of explaining that today and then were different times in some ways in regards to this idea about having people serve for too long. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the conditions under which he would serve, he said he wanted to serve, he could run unelected essentially, or unopposed, I should say. For seat was not being contested initially, is that right?
Yeah, I think mostly that he didn't want to step on, toes at that point.
Right.
But for the most part, he did not run unopposed. I mean, they were all contested, at least elections, maybe nominally more than anything.
Yeah.
But he did. I mean, they were. He ran and had genuine elections all the way through. And he said, I'll only serve for. You can see him saying, I'll only serve for so long. And of course, it just continued, as I suppose it does today. Just kind of continued to happen, and he kept saying yes at a certain point, never turned it down. Again, at the horror of his son, and I think the displeasure of his wife to an extent.
Didn't he also, though, he felt like that election was one of the greatest honors because
Absolutely.
he said, was the people calling me, and he really appreciated it. So again, going back to Cicero and
Right.
civic virtue.
Right, and at the time, as I think many would say today, opponents certainly cast that as an embarrassment, that this former president is going not, again, only to the Senate, but going all the way down to the House of Representatives, going back down. You've been pegged down. The opponents would say, your policies failed as president, now you're just kind of sliding back into this, into this role in the House of Representatives. Of course, and I think that would, the same arguments would be today. If a former president, there would be also, I think it would break the idea of, presidents staying out of politics, but it would be quite, an earth-shattering proposition for a president to go to election in the House of Representatives, not even the Senate, the House of Representatives. But again, for him, this goes back to the real idea of duty, of civic virtue. It's not denying the people, and it's serving in whatever capacity you're called to do to your lot in life what you can do. And he was amongst the founders, obviously the only one that really followed through, I think, in terms of public service, in terms of congressional service for that sort of idea and proposition.
I guess you've been talking about this as you've gone through this House, with the House of Representatives, but what did the people in his hometown, in his home district, and where he grew up and where he lived, what did they think of him? How did they regard him? People in his time and his hometown, his home area.
Yeah, so it's interesting that he was reelected. He was reelected actually for the Plymouth district. So kind of, if you're familiar with Massachusetts geography, going a little bit south, because in many ways he had alienated himself from the Boston community, the center of federalism over his career. So those would be the real archetypal pro-British Federalist. He was elected as a Federalist in the Senate, or at least brought to the Senate as a Federalist, but supported the Louisiana Purchase. He was the only Federalist to do so, and then officially broke with this party over the embargo, the Jeffersonian embargo of 1807, and was really pretty soundly denounced in Boston itself at that stage. And didn't quite recover. Certainly Massachusetts voted for him as president. He had that base. But in terms of going towards Boston, thinking of the Adamses, the Adams political family instead of the Adams family, as a Bostonian family, he really burned a lot of bridges, frankly, again, on the ancient Republican idea of standing for principle. This is my principle. Here's what I'm supposed to vote, but I'm not going to vote for that. This is what I think on those measures. So in terms of support, at least from the Federalists, Big F Federalists, and Boston, he really, I think, was persona non grata for large stages. So in a way, I think his time to Russia and then to Great Britain after that, for about 8 years right after that embargo vote, I think that helped shore up from a distance maybe his reputation back home and in the United States, and helped him, I think, a little bit gain both local and national prominence. And then his support again came, especially from the southern district there in Plymouth, going a little bit south, and I think he must have had a stronger foothold in there with the people. But he would continue, at least in the area that we had burned kind of that Federalist Bridge, give very well-respected public orations, usually on July 4th, through the rest of his life and into his 70s and 60s and into 70s, both in his home in Quincy, in Boston ultimately, and in Newburyport, kind of up on the North Shore, where he'd spent time as an early lawyer. So he had a tempestuous relationship even with his home district and with Boston that certainly had its highs and lows, absolute lows, I think, during the middle stretch of his career, but then shored up ultimately. I think as more people came around and really, especially in Massachusetts, in that area, started to see slavery as the major cause, which is something certainly that he was, or anti-slavery measures, as a significant cause in Congress, which obviously he came around to, I think, in his later life.
Dr. Bell?
You talked about his Christian faith. How was his faith similar to or different from his parents, and did that have any impact on the relationship?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels between them. Certainly, they instilled Abigail in particular instilled. You see these really serious puritanical remnants, I think, coming from Abigail's rearing of John Quincy, saying essentially when he was 10 years old, when he went abroad that first time, quite literally, I would rather you find your grave in the ocean than bring shame essentially to your God or to your family. So there's that real, I think, fear instilled in John Quincy as well. But you see for him, and I think this is what he draws from his parents as well, that his duty, his obligation, his civic duty is absolutely interwoven with his faith and with his duty to God. And we see that, I think, in his voting record and what he's putting forth. These are principles that have not just, tangible significance, I think, for him in the nation. He sees the United States legitimately as, a divinely blessed nation, and it's his duty, and we see that coming from what his parents, I think, raised him on. It's your duty in whatever capacity in life that you have. It is literally your duty to God and to your family to see public service through on that. And I think that's where a lot of his measures, I think that's where a lot of his proposals were coming from. Again, he's a little bit slippery to pin down on his specific theological beliefs throughout his career. I think as a lot of founders were, you see that in their writings. And I think at least joining the church after his father's death, because his father's death was quite a momentous occasion for the United States. And actually, we can maybe bring this up. So you see references actually to his faith in his diary entry here. For those that might not know this story, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died, friends, enemies, and friends died on exactly the 50th anniversary of July 4th. So arguably maybe two of the most important figures of the revolution itself died not just on the same day, not just on any July 4th, but the 50th anniversary of July 4th in 1826. And for John Quincy, I think that was really a reckoning for him, for his faith, for how he, really viewed himself in some cases relative to God. So you see some references in here might be a little bit hard to read, but he's looking at this moment where Jefferson and Adams died at the same time, being essentially a divine blessing, the divine nod on the United States of America, that the nation's going in the right way, that they're setting on the right course here. And it's after that stage that he officially joins the Unitarian Church in Quincy. So I think you see him coming to that reckoning here in that moment, and then having that public manifestation, I think, of his faith in joining the Unitarian Church very, very soon thereafter. And this is so again, this is kind of what the layout is. If you pull up his online diary, it's on the Massachusetts Historical Society website. You can date search it. And I think this is July 9th, 1826. You can pull that up and get a really good sense of what he was thinking there, his father closing for his age.
Can you read that section there where he talks about the decease of Jefferson and the kind of the heartwarming things he says about his father's passing? Can you read that?
The time, the manner, the coincidence with the decease of Jefferson are visible and palpable marks of divine favor, for which I would have humbled myself in grateful and silent adoration before the ruler of the universe. And that's sort of the language that we see of John Quincy, ruler of the universe, divine providence, almighty, things like that. So it's a really poignant entry here, I think. looking for the kind of the larger, I think, implications of this moment. And that was very typical, I think, of the United States at the time. Most did see that as, you know, quite the mark of divine providence. Such an event would happen on exactly that 50th anniversary of July 4th.
What would you say his greatest attribution as a president would be?
His greatest attribution? I think the greatest attribution, and some would say was also maybe his biggest detriment, but his greatest attribution was being an individual of integrity. He really swung for the fences in his first address to Congress in 1825. Again, came in not having the popular vote, certainly having an electoral minority as well, but really put forth his articulation for the nation in a way in which others had told him to temper, had told him to moderate, had told him to work for some conciliation with Congress. That was, in all accounts, probably the politically expedient thing to do. But again, maybe going back to this idea of his duty to God, to family, to nation, that was antithetical to his beliefs. He had to put forward what he thought was the proper, course for the nation, and did so in his first address to Congress. So I think his integrity and ideas of duty were probably his most important and maybe most laudable, I think, in some sense, attributes as president.
Question to follow up with that. The History Channel has portrayed that his dad cautioned him on that. Is there any accuracy to that, or that may not be a wise choice or move for him in his new presidency?
Yeah, I think, I can't speak with specificity to his father. I absolutely think he probably did, and I think almost everyone else did. His cabinet did, with, I think, one sole exception in his cabinet. But I think most around him realized you've got to, I guess, to be a bit colloquial, but you got to read the room. Like, know what's going on if you really want to get this done.
I really liked how they presented it, that his dad called him King Adam. That he would be portrayed as King Adam. And I thought that was
Yeah, there were a lot of, with full disclosure, my dissertation and my work is on John Quincy Adams in Britain. Call it the British paradox for him, of kind of this push and pull with Great Britain. So those sorts of allegations absolutely came through as well, that he's being too monarchical, that John Randolph of Roanoke called John Quincy the American House of Stuart with his father. So you have the kind of the Catholic implications there, but you have these kind of dynastic claims as well. So he was attacked from all sorts of sides. That there's this real concern of that he's a minority president, that maybe this is even a dynasty coming forth, because unlike Washington, unlike Jefferson, unlike Madison, unlike Monroe, and ultimately unlike Jackson, John Adams was the one that had a direct male heir. So that sort of concern was still real at that moment. So he had all of these factors and all of these other individuals telling him to moderate. So it's both sides of the same coin. It's integrity, it's standing up for what you think is your duty, but also kind of breaking with suggestions for political expediency during that time.
Well, since you brought up the British connection, and he seems to know so much about it, how much did George Canning in England, the Prime Minister at the time of the Monroe Doctrine, how much did the success of that doctrine have to do with George Canning?
Well, yeah, a lot of it. I mean, it's a measure to counter Britain, right? So they're trying to tie in, or at least the British proposal was to tie in with the United States to make a joint kind of statement agreement on Latin America, and John Quincy in many ways is trying to outflank that. I think he's trying to outflank it. He's trying to go around the side to some extent, at least with the Monroe Doctrine, saying that we can stand on our own here. This can be a unilateral declaration from the United States here. And I think it's that sort of push and pull that typifies really his career and his affiliations with Britain over the course of his life. It's both trying to outpace, it's both trying to outflank, but also he literally uses the phrase as ambassador to emulate. We need to emulate Britain in terms of, to an extent, some of its political institutions, but also, again, it's scientists, it's poets, it's scholars, it's writers. And that, I think, the Monroe Doctrine is one aspect of it, but I think this tension is one of the key driving factors throughout his entire public service career. Maybe, really, even from his youth and how he was raised. He was taught to both revere the unwritten British Constitution, to look to its paragons of political history, but at the same time hold disdain for this nation that is literally bringing death and destruction, to your door in Boston. So it's a really, that would be a confounding point for anyone, but especially to have that brought into his youth. And then I think that comes through his entire public service career in many ways.
That kind of showed his foresight, though, because like you say, this was a gamble to kind of issue this, but it was really betting on the idea that Britain would be the dominant power of the 19th century.
Right, absolutely.
Particularly the British naval establishment. And it did turn out that way. And it was a way to meld the interests of the two nations together.
While still doing it, at least professing that the United States is now this entity that can
And that's the funny
stand on its own.
thing. He got the British to do what we wanted to do.
Right.
Because it was in their interest, but before they could realize it.
Absolutely.
I think Canning did come to understand that. He was going to fool them.
Canning did.
Yeah. What else? We need statesmen like that today who could do that. It's really important.
You see a lot of his foresight and a lot of this. I think his shrewdest moves came as Secretary of State. Monroe Doctrine, maybe reading the winds in that, the Convention of 1818. I really think that Oregon Territory, pushing that back decade by decade, ultimately coming to fruition. And that the Adams-Onis Treaty, setting some of the southwestern boundaries, but also having Florida ceded to the United States. And in fact, I think maybe one of his other biggest accomplishments as Secretary of State, also dealing with Britain, that is far underplayed, was he laid the groundwork for it, but it was the Rush-Bagot Treaty that was the first naval disarmament. Both nations agreed to naval disarmament on the Great Lakes. So literally starting to talk about scaling back militarily at this time. It was one of the first ever proclamations and understandings of that sort. But that's him, again, working with the British and reaching that, I think, understanding through his time there as ambassador. But to me, that's one of the, again, a very shrewd move at the time for the Secretary of State, going against some of the prevailing winds and understandings of militarism, I think, and just in that post-Napoleonic world.
Yes. Okay. So, what is different, or what changed about the American political landscape during Congress that we don't see that anymore? President running for one of the houses, or the House or the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, it was, even at the time, it was an absurd, really, many viewed it as an absurd proposition. It's kind of a fun trivia fact, though. He's not the only former president to be elected to a House of Representatives. John Tyler was actually elected to the Confederate House of Representatives. He died before I think he was sworn in, but Tyler also did that, and of course Andrew Johnson with the Senate thereafter. But I think he was so steeped in maybe, one of the differences you could look to, I guess, Greek and Roman history. I mean, that's where he was drawing his parallels from. And I think probably we've lost some of that. Just as a society, in terms of education, we don't really look to Greek and Roman Republican standards as much. I know, at least certainly in my education, that wasn't a part of it growing up. But those are the sorts of figures that he was so steeped in as a youth, and that's really where his worldview came from. And I think that ultimately led him to go on towards that post-presidential career.
So once he was in the House, did they address him as president?
That's a good question. Yeah, we've looked into that. In fact, some did, but oftentimes Southerners, as he grew on, were more dismissive of him, and would have all sorts of kind of relatively humorous epithets that they would toss at him. One that stuck, which I think was both, I think maybe he had it on the poster, but both kind of a positive and negative spin, was Old Man Eloquent, is what he came to be called by many in terms of his speeches. So I think both a bit derisive, but then for his supporters, laudatory in the sense that he's this paragon of the early republic. So that would be kind of the more flippant phrase I think that was often used for him.
scholarship and learning, have you ever come across any of his, being such an ambiguous president and not really adhering to one way or the other, even within his own party, what would be his biggest regret, or do you feel any failures as a president or as a person?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you, I mean, almost, especially every birthday, he's almost self-flagellation in terms of that I have done nothing of use for the nation. I've done nothing of use for the country. He regretted, I think, almost everything that he did, which is almost crazy to read. But it was, I think, a lot of the mentality that he was going back to that letter from Abigail at 10 years old. That you must bring success. I would rather you die, literally die, than bring shame. So he, I think, really wished, as crazy as it sounds to us, that he would have done more, that he could have done more, that he somehow could have been more successful. And I think he really regretted that throughout his life. And you see that pop through, especially in those birthday entries throughout his diary.
And he was also obviously such a great compromiser. I mean, in his foreign policy and the Monroe Doctrine. So how could he not make that work during his presidency? Did he just simply not have the following? Or?
Yeah, certainly the way that he came into the presidency was, I think, played a large part of that. And the fact that I think once he reached that pinnacle, he saw that this is, again, maybe God, nations, family, self. This is the time in which I can articulate most clearly my vision for the country. That for whatever reason he, maybe he was swinging. I think one read could be, and I think maybe I subscribe to that, he was swinging for the fences in the sense that maybe through these bold proclamations, I'll somehow actually win more support for this through being bold, through taking action. Obviously, if that's what he thought, that was naive and short-sighted because that didn't happen. But I think maybe there was a way in which he thought, through taking bold measures, I'll win a groundswelling of support. But again, it wasn't reading for whatever reason, the congressional wins appropriately, because that was certainly not the case. Congress was somewhat favorable in terms of its electoral return to him in 1824, and even then he couldn't get things through. Then after 1826, it was during the midterm election, it was pretty much a landslide for what would become the Jacksonian Party. And after that, you see, I think, meeker, somewhat more conciliatory addresses to Congress, while still coming back to, usually at the end, in his last one, essentially, the last paragraph is saying, what my vision, paraphrasing, but what my vision for the country is. I've outlined it many times, and I hope that ultimately, you'll come to see the mistakes that you as a Congress have made. But yeah, the entries, there's a lot of self-doubt, a lot of self-castigation, I think, throughout his career, which to anyone looking at the full record, it's still outstanding. I think it's certainly something that takes you aback a bit in reading through it.
Okay, well, I want to remind students, if you did come in to sign these sheets, which I believe are in the back.
Can I mention the part as well?
Please do. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pull up one last thing here too. So if you find yourself out in Boston at any point making a trip, the park really, and obviously I'm work there, but I think there are a couple of great resources in terms of John Quincy, in terms of the family. One is the Massachusetts Historical Society, so both for students, educators, just general interest. What they have available online, they have all of the physical copies there in the archives, but what they have available online is really incredible. For John and Abigail, for the entire family, a lot of Jefferson's papers there online. It's really an incredible resource. And for John Quincy, just being able to go through that, date search it, it's going to be transcribed in full at some point in the future, so it's going to become an even better resource. But at the park, it's comprised of, kind of up in the corner there, that's an early 19th century depiction, but it's comprised of the old house at Peacefield, which is essentially the mansion house for the family from 1787 all the way through 1927. We interpret 1788 through 1927. We interpret 4 generations of the family there. There are over 77,000 original objects there. Everything's intact as the family left it. So many great resources there. Really gives you a sense of place, of presence to the family that I think a lot of other presidential sites just don't have, because so much was lost over the years, removed, sold off. And the park also encompasses the 2 presidential birthplaces for both John and John Quincy Adams, One was built in 1681, the other was built in 1663, so they're the two oldest and closest still standing presidential birthplaces in the country. So it's guided tours from April 19th through November 10th, actually, so just getting ready to start the season, and is, to my mind, a great MPS unit if you're out on the East Coast at any time in the future. Site will be there, so just wanted to mention that as well.
Definitely. Big fan of the NPS.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, Mr. Shimp will be down here if you want to take any more questions, but I appreciate you coming tonight. Drive safe, and thank you. We'll see you again for the Constitution Day around September 17th. Be watching this online, and thank you very much.